Hello, I'm Rachel from Douentza Garden in Ireland, and today we're going to talk about dahlias. Now, we all know and love dahlias for their amazing exotic blooms and for the oomph they add to our flower beds. But what you might know is that there are at least 14 different groupings of dahlias. These groupings are used to categorise plants with similar flowering characteristics. So, if you want to know the difference between a pom-pom and a cactus dahlia and the pros and cons of each, then stay tuned. For today's video, I'm taking you to the Botanic Gardens in Dublin, where they have an amazing dahlia display every autumn. The Botanic Gardens is free to the public and has many plant displays both outdoors and in their greenhouses. We've come to see dahlias and to understand the different groupings, but before we start, it's worth noting that this is a very fluid subject. My reference RHS encyclopedia from 1997 lists 10 groupings of dahlia, whereas the UK's National Dahlia Society now lists 14. While dahlias are grown in many countries, particularly the US, where the American Dahlia Society plays an active role, the authority for registration of dahlias is the RHS in the UK. Besides being a fluid subject, botanists regularly argue over dahlia classification. Thousands of varieties are bred all over the world, and suppliers may list certain dahlias differently. Dahlias have 30 or 42 species depending on your source, and over 20,000 cultivars, which means a huge range in varieties. These include dwarf dahlias and those that can grow taller than a man or a woman. And as for the flower size, there are tiny inch-wide dahlias as well as dinner plate-sized ones. The good news is that all dahlias, regardless of groupings, are grown in the same way. And finally, before we get into describing and looking at the 14 different groupings of gorgeous dahlias, just a little note on exhibiting. Dahlias that are to be exhibited in a show are often classified by the width of the flower head within broad groupings. The classifications are giant, large, medium, small and miniature, with the large flowered dahlias measuring upwards of 10 inches or 25 centimetres. But the precise dimensions for these size categories vary according to the different specifications of different national dahlia societies or shows. So you might have a show with a category for large cactus dahlias. Let's now look at the different groupings, and we start with group 1, the single dahlia. Single dahlias have open centred flower heads. They've 1 or 2 rows of petals which may overlap. The petals may be rounded or pointed. These petals are technically referred to as ray florets. They surround a central cluster of tiny disc florets, often in a contrasting colour. There's something very light and airy about single dahlias, something quite childlike in the simplicity of the flowers and the way that they seem to float and bob above the greenery of flower beds. Many gardeners who say they don't like dahlias will make an exception for the single varieties, and indeed gardeners are not the only ones to love these blooms. Single dahlias are much loved by bees, butterflies, hoverflies and all sorts of pollinators who can easily access the central parts of the flower. So on the plus side, single dahlias will get your garden humming with beneficial insects. Here's a fun fact. Any seed collected from the complex double varieties will not come true, but will instead give rise to plants with single flowers, like this one, which I grew many years ago. Dahlias aren't hard to grow from seed and will flower in the first year. Another advantage of single dahlias is, because of the lightness of their flowers, they often need no staking. But while the simplicity of the flower is a selling point for single dahlias, it's also the downside. Many people grow dahlias because of their exotic looking flower appearance. The large, brightly coloured blooms are what attracts them, and you don't get this with single dahlias that are usually less than 10 centimetres or 4 inches across. I have a number of self-grown single dahlias that I love, but my favourite cultivar has got to be the miniature Roxy, which makes an ideal dahlia for the front of a border and a good candidate for a pot. The Anemone-flowered dahlia is an absolute stunner. Flower heads are double and quite complex. They're composed of one or more rings of flattened outer petals. These surround a flower interior of dense, upward pointing tubular florets. These tiny tubes are all clustered together in the middle and poke out horizontally from the flower. The result is that the centre of the flower, where the eye or disc floret usually resides in single flowers, is much longer and more 3D in anemone dahlias. Flower heads are usually 10 to 15 centimetres wide, that's 4 to 6 inches. The big advantage with this type of dahlia is the exotic look of the blooms. The downside is that anemone type dahlias are harder to source than other types, and there are fewer varieties. I've also found that as the blooms fade, the central tubular section is the first to look brown, and as it's so prominent, I feel the need to deadhead blooms earlier than with other types of dahlia. My favourite anemone flowered dahlias are Freya's Paso Doble, which has a very pale flower, and Blue Bayou, which is actually different shades of purple despite its name. Its blooms last longer than those of the Paso Doble. We move on now to the Colorette dahlias, which has a very wide appeal. Note the interesting spelling, Collerette. Flower heads have an outer single row of usually flat petals. The petals may overlap and they surround an inner ring of shorter petals. This inner ring of shorter petals is known as the collar, and it surrounds the central disc. The shorter petals of the collar are symmetrical and may be a different colour from the main petals. Flower heads are usually 10 to 15 centimetres, that's 4 to 6 inches across. This grouping of dahlia has a lot of charm. It combines the simplicity of the single flowered forms with a little twist of exoticism in the form of the collar. The collar definitely adds interest. Generally speaking, many of the Colorette dahlias don't need staking, as the flowers have fewer petals than the large double forms. Fewer petals means less weight and less of a need to support that weight. My absolute favourite of all Colorette dahlias is the bright little imp called Pooh. It has cheery colours and injects such an element of playfulness in any border that is the first plant people notice. Now we come to a very elegant dahlia that is properly double. Flower heads have broad petals which are either flat or slightly incurved or recurved along their sides. This curvature of the petals, either inwards or outwards, gives the blooms a flattened saucer-like appearance. The centre of the flower is firm and closed, and the depth of the flower is generally 1/3 of the diameter of the bloom. There's something very symmetrical, smooth and satisfying about the flower shape, which really sings Fibonacci sequencing to me. Water lily dahlias are often confused with decorative ones, especially since they both range in flower size from miniature to giant. If in doubt, look to the centre of the bloom to see if it's closed and the proportions of the flower depth compared to its diameter. It should be 1/3. The downside is that water lily dahlias do need proper staking. Now we come to the amazing decorative dahlias. There are so many different varieties of decorative dahlias out there, and the flowers range in size from 4 inches to a whopping 10 inches. The main defining elements are that decorative dahlia flower heads are fully double, showing no central disc. Petals are broad, generally flat or slightly incurved along their length. Sometimes petals are slightly twisted and they usually have blunt tips. Many modern varieties have a high petal count. Blooms are classified by size and range from miniature to giant. Decorative dahlias are by far my favourite group. I say this because there are lots of groups that really appeal to me, but when it comes to varieties, I find that the varieties that I buy over and over again tend to end up belonging to the decorative grouping. My favourite varieties are Alvas regalia and Karma Choc. The shape of these blooms is superb, but the luminosity of colour in Alvas regalia is quite magical. Karma Choc has a really neat shape, easily confused with the water lily group until you get the measuring tape out. But the dark colour is what clinches it for me. Decorative dahlias need staking, and the dinner plate varieties need very sturdy staking. A sheltered spot is also desirable, as any wind will wreak havoc even with the best staked dinner plate varieties. But decorative dahlias are definitely worth the trouble. Ball dahlias are quite distinctive looking, but often confused with the pom-pom ones. The main difference is that ball dahlias are larger than pom-pom ones. Flower heads are fully double and ball shaped, hence the name. The ball might be slightly flattened at the top. The petals are spirally arranged, incurved for more than half of their length, and blunt or rounded at the tips. The petals are tubular in appearance. Ball dahlias can also be confused with decorative dahlias in that they have fully double blooms, but look out for the spherical shape and the tubular petals. Blooms are classified by size and range from miniature up to small flowered, so there are no giant blooms here. Ball dahlias had fallen out of fashion for many years, often associated with maidenly aunts and pernickety horticulture shows, but they've recently made a comeback. Their spherical shape and perfection of form work so well in a variety of garden settings where they make good contrasts with a looseness and more relaxed planting. My absolute favourite ball dahlia is Jomanda, with its bright orange colour and perfection of form. Pom-pom dahlias are similar to ball dahlias, but more spherical, more rounded. They have petals that are incurved for the whole of their length and look like perfect tubes. Pom-pom dahlias have globe-shaped double blooms with blunted petal tips. Flower heads are small, no more than 5 centimetres, that's 2 inches across, so really small. I suppose the upside of pom-pom dahlias is their perfection of form and the fact that they don't usually need staking. But the downside is the smallness of their flowers. With small flowers, you really need an abundance of blooms to compensate for the vastness of the green foliage. Dahlia foliage isn't its selling point, and with any pom-pom dahlias I've grown, the proportion of bloom to foliage wasn't right. Our next grouping is that of cactus dahlias. Cactus dahlias are very popular and produce fully double flower heads. They have long, narrow, pointed petals that are strongly recurved for more than half of their length and either straight or curling towards the centre of the bloom. Blooms have a characteristic spiky appearance. Blooms are classified by size and range from miniature to giant. Cactus dahlias are very often confused with semi-cactus dahlias, but we'll learn about the difference in a moment. If you love the shape of cactus dahlias, then you should grow lots. They make superb cut flowers too. Personally, I don't like this flower formation, so can't give you any favourites as I don't grow them. I've nothing negative to say about this dahlia at all, it's just my personal dislike. Plants will need staking. The blooms of semi-cactus dahlias are fully double with slightly pointed petals. Petals are broader at the base than those of cactus dahlias. They're recurved for up to half of their length towards the petal tip and either straight or curling towards the centre. Blooms range from miniature to giant. Semi-cactus dahlias differ from true cactus dahlias in that they have broader petals that are only curved for about half their length. There are lots of colourful semi-cactus dahlias to choose from, but my favourite is Bora Bora for its vibrancy of contrasting colours. Besides the fact that they need staking, the downside with these dahlias is how the blooms fade. The spiky petals at the back of the flower near the stem are the first to look brown and tatty, and this can happen quite quickly, making this a tricky dahlia to enter in a competition. There needs to be no hint of brown for exhibition flowers. In the garden I'm less finicky and allow the backs of the blooms to brown considerably before I deadhead. However, if you have a more pristine flower bed, then semi-cactus dahlias are going to require a lot of deadheading. This grouping of dahlias is the catch-all for ones not covered in any other category. The miscellaneous group notably holds all species dahlias. Species dahlias are all single-flowered, but don't belong to group 1. Species dahlias have been hybridized to form the many different groupings we're discussing in this video. The fact that this catch-all group is group 10, but we still have 4 more groupings to discuss, will let you know that in the not too distant past, 11 to 14 fell into the miscellaneous group. There may be informal groups here, including chrysanthemum, lilliput, thistle and stellar dahlias. Stellar dahlias are a form defined by the American Dahlia Society. By the way, I do think that terms like chrysanthemum dahlia and anemone dahlia, basically where a dahlia is compared to some other unrelated plant, can be very confusing to people. My favourite miscellaneous dahlia is Dahlia australis. Our next grouping is that of fimbriated or laciniated dahlias. On fimbriated dahlias, the tips of the petals have 2 or 3 even splits or notches, creating a ruffled or fringed effect. The petals themselves can vary and may be flat, involute, revolute, straight, incurved or twisted. The important element here is the fringed nature of the blooms. This is an unusual dahlia and hard to come by, but definitely one to look out for. Now we move on to the star group of dahlias. This is also sometimes known as the single orchid group. I think the term star better describes this dahlia's characteristics. Star dahlias have a single outer ring of petals surrounding a central disc. The petals are either involute or revolute. You may ask, what's the difference between this type of dahlia and the single group? With this group, the curved nature of the outer ring of petals makes the whole flower look like a star emanating from the central disc. Star dahlias are becoming easier to find these days and can be bought in many places in packets in spring. The Honka series is the one you'll tend to see. Group 13 is that of the double orchid dahlias. These flowers have fully double blooms showing no disc and have triangular centres. Petals are narrowly lance-shaped and either involute or revolute. And our final group of dahlias is the peony dahlia. Peony dahlias have several rings of petals surrounding a central disc. Petals are flat or slightly involute, that means curved inwards, at the base. This group includes some notable dahlias with dark foliage, including the Bishop series. My absolute favourite, however, is Dahlia Fascination. Its gorgeous pink, multi-petalled flower sits atop superb dark foliage. While dark foliage isn't a requirement for this group, dark-leaved dahlias are very desirable and worth looking out for because the cabbagey foliage on dahlias is often seen as their main disadvantage. So, those are the 14 different groupings of dahlias and their pros and cons, and I'm sure there are ones there that will appeal to every taste. What's your favourite type of dahlia? And tell me why. And to end with a fun fact, did you know that dahlias were first discovered in Mexico during the 16th century? The tubers were grown as a food crop by the Aztecs, and that's how it was originally imported to Europe. Personally, I've tried eating them in a variety of ways, but I didn't think much of the taste, and I'll just stick to growing this fabulous plant in the garden from now on. The dahlia was declared the national flower of Mexico in 1963. Thanks for watching. Do check out my other dahlia videos in the playlist I'm linking to here, and I'll see you on the next video. Have a great day. Bye!